The Algerian's criminality, his impulsivity, and the violence of his murders are therefore not the consequence of the organisation of his nervous system, nor of a particular trait in his character, but the direct product of the colonial situation. Welcome back for another book review. I am ahead of the curve, and in this video I will be reviewing Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, published in 1961. What is this book about? Well, it's essentially about the violence that is manifested from the act of colonization, and how colonization is inherently, as Fanon would put it, an evil phenomenon. So I think I'll just read you out the back of the book, the description that they give you, just for a more comprehensive description, better than what I could probably try and come up with myself. Written at the height of the Algerian War for Independence, Frantz Fanon's classic text has provided inspiration for anti-colonial movements ever since. With power and anger, Fanon makes clear the economic and psychological degradation inflicted by imperialism. It was Fanon himself, a psychotherapist, who exposed the connection between colonial war and mental disease, who showed how the fight for freedom must be combined with building a national culture, and who showed the way ahead through revolutionary violence to socialism. Many of the great calls to arms from the era of decolonization are now purely of historical context, yet this passionate polemic is just as illuminating about the world we live in today. And that is true, the last sentence. Whilst you could say the premise of the piece is outdated, the ideas are certainly not. And a lot of what the author is putting across, you can actually see manifested in the world today. For example, racial bigotry and so on. Alright, so before I get into the main crux of the ideas in the book, I want to give complete credit to the introduction, which was written by Jean-Paul Sartre, which, I mean, it's honestly a brilliant introduction, I must admit. One of the best introductions I've ever read to a book before, because he doesn't kind of step on the toes of the author, so to speak. He more talks about the background of how this author, Fanon, came to write this piece, and why his opinion should be valued and taken seriously, even if the situations, the historical scenarios are not happening today as such. But again, the ideas are still around and they're still relevant. So there's a couple things I want to read out. I mean, I've underlined a fair few of what Sartre wrote in the introduction, but I'll read out a couple things that I found really, really interesting. Anyway, I'll get on with it. We only become what we are by the radical and deep-seated refusal of which others have made of us. So let me just go into this a bit. So here, I mean, you know, it's only a sentence long, more or less, or 2 sentences long. But what Sartre is pointing out here is it's sort of, I mean, it's unrelated in one way because it's more of a philosophical anecdote, but it also refers to why people act in a certain way if they're put under a totalitarian repression. And he's basically saying that we are a product of what we are trying to actively deny from others telling us what we are. So maybe that's a mouthful. But essentially, it's like Albert Camus, actually. Albert Camus, he believed that life itself is a form of rebellion. And I think Sartre definitely agrees with him in that regard, because obviously Sartre and Camus, they're kind of the two face figures of existentialism, along with like Nietzsche and Kierkegaard. But yeah, no, that was a really interesting couple sentences that I thought you'd probably enjoy hearing. So the next one I will read now. You said they understand nothing but violence. Of course, first, the only violence is the settlers. But soon they will make it their own. That is to say, the same violence is thrown back upon us as when our reflection comes forward to meet us when we go towards a mirror. Again, this reminds me of this racial bigotry and the politics surrounding Black Lives Matter and so on. Starts basically pointing out and highlighting that before we try and point fingers and blame other people for acting in a certain way, we have to understand how they got to that position in the first place. And especially with colonization, if you're going to blame the natives who might be violent or who might be disrespectful to the settlers, before as a settler you blame the natives for their behaviour, maybe you should just look at yourself and realise, maybe my existence, my very influence on the native who, let's be honest, was originally there in the first place and who deserved to be there from birthright. Sartre is saying that we should look in the mirror before we try and make any assertions or implications that are trying to crucify somebody else or to blame somebody else. And I find, like, with the Black Lives Matter thing as well, like, the reason why there was such an outcry is because there was a certain repression amongst this group. And so the only way to fight against it was to essentially do what they did. And of course, some of it wasn't exactly helpful, but I think Martin Luther King had a really good quote. I'm probably going to forget it now, but I'll put it up. Yeah, I'll put it up on the screen and for you to read. Yeah, because I don't think I can remember it now, but yeah. And all this dialogue actually reminds me of a book that I reviewed a few months ago, probably about 5-6 months ago. It was called The Earth is Weeping, and I think it's one of the least popular videos that I actually released, probably just because it's not exactly directed at something that you would like. But the book is essentially is a history book, but not written boringly and like a textbook. It's essentially a book on the colonization of America and the Native Americans being oppressed and betrayed. I mean, I talked about it in that video, which I think you might enjoy watching that, just because I talk a bit more about the situation, the historical situation that they were in as natives and being essentially forced out of their way of life and their life entirely, I'd also add. But there was one instance when a treaty was established between the natives and the American battalions, and essentially the chief came up to the soldiers, the captain, waving a legislation saying they can be there, they have their place, they're permitted to be there and to have a reservation. And as he was waving it and riding towards the chief or the general, he was shot, and the regulations, the agreement was forgotten about and betrayed. And that was something very, very common in that time. And I'm sure it was very common in the time that in Algeria, when the author is talking about or extrapolating from most of the time throughout the book. So yeah, it made me think of that book, which I'll link I'll mention that video at the end of this one. Yeah, just wait until the end and then you'll see it pop up. But yeah, I would recommend you watching that one, because I do talk deeply about colonization and the violence behind it. But to dig deeper into my original point about colonization and its implications, its violent implications, is that colonization starts out with some kind of innocent approach to civilization and building a civilization, and the veil is pulled and it turns into something that is, well, I would say, from the start, naturally coercive. And I'll use this word again because this is what it is. It's violent. And that happened for the natives in America, and it happened for the examples Fanon is pointing out. So I do stand by the idea or the political perspective that colonization is inherently coercive and overall just forceful, imperial, which is pretty much the statement that the author's making as well. So I would say the most interesting and also disturbing parts of this piece is the 5th chapter, which is called Colonial War and Mental Disorders. And it talks about various cases, including a man who tortures his wife and child in the name of the Algerian policy, and I don't remember how old this child is, probably about 9 or 8 or something like that. And they kill their friend because the father of this friend said that the child should be killed or something for who they are because of the politics surrounding Algeria and so forth. So the child took it out on their friend whose dad who said that. Yeah, maybe I just worded that very confusingly, but anyway, look, it was very it just shows the nature of brainwashing and how politics influences thinking. I mean, it reminds me of the Orwellian sort of themes and Fahrenheit 451, Huxley and all sorts. It's you know, the differences between this book and those, what I just mentioned, is that those are fiction, but this is real, and this is the manifestation of those ideas in reality, which is the scary thing about it. I'm going to actually read out a piece of dialogue, and this is between the interviewer and the child. Yeah, this is the child speaking, and then the next one will be the interviewer, and so forth. Well then, why do they want to kill us? His father is in the militia, and he said we ought to have our throats cut. But he didn't say anything to you. Him? No. You know he is dead now. Yes. What does being dead mean? When it's all finished, you go to heaven. Was it you who killed him? Yes. Does having killed somebody worry you? No, since they want to kill us. So, do you mind being in prison? No. So as I'm showing you here, that is the piece of dialogue that I'm talking about. And it just shows the indifference, and I think this is a product of the indoctrination and the brainwashing, and again, what I mentioned before, how the political status of Algeria affected not only the men and women, but also the children and how they're brought up to think. And so this child killed another child in the name of what they've been brought up to think. So looking at the torture section, I'm not going to read it all out, but yeah, there's a form of torture called the motionless torture, which is the prisoner is placed on his knees with his arms parallel to the ground, the palms of his hands turned upwards, his torso and head straight. No movement is allowed. Behind the prisoner, a policeman sitting on a chair keeps him motionless by the blows of his truncheon. But yeah, no, there's just kind of listing of the different methods of how these police officers tortured people who were suspected in this regime. And again, this is the horrors of totalitarianism, the horrors of what war precedes. So I think a lot of the things in this piece probably went over my head just because I'm not as educated on Algerian history, and I'm not familiar as much as I'd like to be with this whole kind of political scene, which I'm trying to get into more as of late, or at least the past kind of year and a half. I'm looking much more into politics, and I must say that certain figures, certain writers have definitely got me more into politics. because yeah, I think it's the implications of political policies that I'm interested in, how people behave in turn from what they're told to do or to think. So in that case, I probably will, well, I definitely will go and reread this again, because it's full of really interesting anecdotes, and that introduction by Sartre is brilliant. As I said, one of my favourite introductions I've read. He clearly knew what colonisation meant, and he understood the. Of course, he was an existentialist, but he knew he was also intertwined with politics, I suppose. So he knew the case that the author was putting forward, and he respected that without. I mean, he did point out that, of course, some of these things will be outdated nowadays, but nevertheless, the ideas themselves remain to be true and present in the modern world. Yeah, so I think that's all I want to say about this book. Overall, really, really enjoyable. Although I would say a lot of it I didn't understand as much as I would like to admit I did. But again, that's why these kind of books should be reread over and over again, just to really understand the polemics that is put forward and the unique ideas and so forth. So yeah, as always, thank you for watching. Check out my Goodreads, my Instagram, my Patreon if you'd like to donate and to get additional benefits from me. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next week.